Hello and welcome to this presentation of the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office Spring Workshop Series. This is the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And I'm Christina Wyckoff. I am the Section 106 Coordinator and Historical Archaeologist here at the Oklahoma SHPO. In this presentation, we will briefly discuss the National Historic Preservation Act overall. We will specifically talk about Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the four-step Section 106 review process in detail, and program alternatives, and how to prepare a submittal for review by our office here in Oklahoma. Okay. So the National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA. I'm going to start by just reading you this quote from the Special Committee report with Heritage So Rich. Without some relics, the total past becomes less than a myth, neither useful nor believable, but only a sense of unknown loss of knowledge which might exist, a vanished world left for conjecture of imagined cities in the sun. So the National Historic Preservation Act was a response to the impacts of large federal projects on historic resources across the country. Some examples of these federal programs that had these impacts are the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956, the Housing Act of 1949, and Housing and Urban Development Acts of 1965 and 1968. These are just a handful of examples, but you have large federal projects designed to provide improvements, but that aren't considering the significance of resources that exist within their project footprint. And this has a profound impact on communities, and the response is pretty considerable. So I wanted to throw in some examples. These are just news clippings from Oklahoma newspapers that are recognizing the issue at the time. These are from 1965. And here's a particular example from Tulsa of a building which was being removed as part of urban renewal. And that folks here in Oklahoma, as well as elsewhere around the country, acknowledged the need for preservation and the need to protect these resources. So this language comes from the Act. The spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon and reflected in its historic heritage. The historical and cultural foundations of the nation should be preserved as a living part of our community life and development in order to give a sense of orientation to the American people. Historic properties significant to the nation's heritage are being lost or substantially altered, often inadvertently, with increasing frequency. So the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted by the 89th U.S. Congress. It's bipartisan. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1966, and it established a partnership between federal, state, tribal, and local governments, and supported, through federal funding, preservation activities, and was positively received at least by many people in Oklahoma as well as around the nation. And this article from the Daily Oklahoman talks about the National Trust for Historic Preservation and preservation actions and ones that might be pursued in the state. And this is from 1966. The National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA, does a number of things. Among them, it authorized the National Register of Historic Places, or NRHP. It created the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP. It created state historic preservation offices for all states and territories. And through the 1992 amendment, created tribal historic preservation offices. And NHPA established consideration of historic preservation as part of the federal planning process. And that's what we're going to talk about, Section 106. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Section 106 requires federal agencies to consider the effects their projects may have on historic properties. Section 106 is required when there is a federal project with potential to affect historic properties. So you need both a federal undertaking and potential to affect historic properties. That's when Section 106 applies. A federal undertaking, just to define a couple of these terms, a federal undertaking is a project involving federal funding, federal lands, a federal license or permit, or other federal assistance. And a historic property is any building, structure, object, site, or district listed on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. It's important to note that properties do not have to be listed on the National Register to be considered during Section 106. So I'm just going to walk through a few examples here to highlight which of these would likely be subject to Section 106. I have 4 examples. 3 of these would likely be subject to 106 and 1 would likely not. So a home rehabilitation using grant funding through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, would likely be subject to Section 106 because of the involvement of the federal agency HUD. The grant funding through HUD would be the federal nexus that would make the project subject to Section 106. Construction of a new cell tower, this is B, construction of a new cell tower requiring a Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, permit. So the federal nexus here would be the FCC permit. That would be why a new cell tower would be subject to Section 106 review. C, roadway improvements using Federal Highways Administration, or FHWA, funding. So the Federal Highways Administration funding in this project would be the federal nexus that would make the project likely subject to Section 106. And then privately funded rehabilitation work at a home listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This is D. And this project, based on the information I'm including here, it's a privately funded project to a National Register of Historic Places property. So this would not be subject to Section 106 unless there's some other federal involvement that I haven't told you here. So we're presuming that this project is not subject to 106. Please do note, though, that just because Section 106 isn't involved doesn't mean there are no other preservation considerations that have to be made. Municipalities, cities have their own review process for for properties that are significant in those municipalities, etc. But for the purposes of Section 106, an NRHP listed property being privately rehabbed is not subject to Section 106 review. So why do we do this? What is the importance of Section 106? Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act gives communities, preservationists, and the public a voice in the federal planning process. Section 106 provides an opportunity to advocate for resources before they're demolished or impacted by a federal project. And the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or the ACHP, their regulations detail the steps and timeframes of the Section 106 process. These are in 36 CFR Part 800. The regulations were updated and there are new numbers, but we all talk about Section 106, and those are the numbers that I'm going to use here. You can find this in the handouts that are part of this presentation. Section 106, it is important to note, is a procedural law. It is not a substantive law, which means Section 106 dictates the process, not any particular outcome. And under Section 106, agencies must consult with others, including the State Historic Preservation Office and/or Tribal Historic Preservation Office, tribes, and the public, to complete the review process before they make a decision on a project. And Agencies must provide the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation an opportunity to comment, and agencies remain responsible for all findings and eligibility determinations through this process. This is a quick note on anticipatory demolition. This is actually section 110K, but this section of the National Historic Preservation Act prohibits a federal agency from granting a loan, permit, license, or other assistance to an applicant who, with intent to avoid the requirements of Section 106, intentionally, significantly, adversely affects a historic property to which the grant would relate, or having legal power to prevent it, has allowed such significant adverse effect to occur prior to completion of Section 106 review. So this section uh, works to prevent folks from sort of sidestepping the Section 106 project or process by impacting a resource ahead of the review. And please do not begin demolition, construction, or other work prior to completion of your Section 106 review by the federal agency to ensure that you will have access to those funds. To carry out the federal historic preservation programs in Oklahoma, we, as other states and territories, follow the regulations, standards, and guidelines of the National Park Service and the regulations and guidance of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So with that, I'm going to start talking about the four-step process itself. So this is the four-step Section 106 process. It's really quite simple, the process itself, and sometimes there are complications at any one of these steps, but overall, the process we always make it through. So step one, I'm just going to read these four steps first, and then we're going to go into each of them. Initiate the process. Step two, identify historic properties. Step three, assess adverse effects. And step four, resolve adverse effects. Not all steps of the process will be necessary for every project. The Section 106 process may end after an earlier step if there are no historic properties or no effects or no adverse effects. But sometimes you have to go all the way through all four steps to reach the end. So we'll begin with step one, initiate the process. This is the what and the who, essentially. You need to identify and define the project, and you need to determine who needs to be involved. So who will be your responsible federal agency, the appropriate state historic preservation office and or tribal historic preservation office or offices, and additional consulting parties. We'll go into those in a minute too. And at this very first step of the 106 process, the agency must make a plan to involve the public, because in addition to each of these consulting parties, the public also has a voice in this process. So this is a quick note about Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, the State Historic Preservation Office and the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey work together to complete the Section 106 reviews. The Oklahoma Archaeological Survey is the repository for Oklahoma's archaeological site files. They maintain all of the site files and reports, and our office, the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, has a cooperative agreement with the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey for these Section 106 reviews. The Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office comments on post-contact, post-European contact archaeological resources and on built environment resources. But the state archaeologist with OAS, there's a typo there, it's just one S, comments regarding pre-contact archaeological resources. Oh, and I do have a question here, and I do want to jump back here for just a second let's go to when Section 106 applies. So Section 106 applies to any project with federal involvement. So if there's federal involvement in a project, whether that's HUD involvement, like if a city is going to do work that involves housing and urban development funding or permitting from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or any other, so a city can be doing any kind of a project that involves a federal agency. And that project, because of the federal agency involvement, would in fact be subject to Section 106. But if something is being privately funded, has no federal involvement, then that project would not be subject to Section 106. But I did want to make clear that there may be that cities may have their own um, review process that is required. If somebody is doing something privately and is in a district that is recognized by a city, there's a separate process they would likely have to follow. That does not fall under Section 106. That is totally separate from this presentation. Shelley, I hope that's clear. Let me know if it isn't, and I'll come back to it. Oops. Make sure I can get back to where I was. Okay, I'm going to just jump here and then we'll go forward. Okay, here we go again. So step one, we initiate the process, we identify and define the project, and we are now working to determine the appropriate people who are involved. So you want to identify at this point whether you need to be working with the State Historic Preservation Office or multiple State Historic Preservation Offices if your project crosses multiple states, and or tribal historic preservation offices. So if a project is on tribal land and there is a tribal historic preservation officer with an agreement with the Park Service, it's a 101(d)(2) agreement, then the tribal historic preservation officer may have assumed some or all of the duties of the State Historic Preservation Office for that tribal land. So where is your project? Is it on tribal land? Is it not? This is important to determine because it will help you to determine whether you need to be beginning with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office or with the State Historic Preservation Office. If your project is on tribal land, what is the State Historic Preservation Office's role? There are possibilities that the State Historic Preservation Office may also be involved in your project if it's on tribal land, if one of these three things apply. One, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer can invite the State Historic Preservation Office to participate in a project. If the THPO invites the SHPO's participation, then the SHPO may participate as a consulting party. And the SHPO may also participate if an undertaking on tribal lands has the potential to affect historic properties that are located off of tribal lands. So for instance, a cell tower project, that is, the cell tower is on tribal lands, but has potential to affect the areas beyond tribal lands that are on state or federal lands, then the State Historic Preservation Officer would also participate. Then the third example is the SHPO participation may be requested by a non-tribal member who owns lands within the exterior boundaries of a reservation. But in this instance, the SHPO's participation is only with regard to that private property within the boundaries of the reservation. So if your project is on tribal land, you're working with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, but there may be SHPO involvement for one of these reasons. So beyond the SHPO or the THPO, who is going to be involved? Consulting parties that should be considered are local governments who may be affected or interested in this project, applicants for federal assistance, interested federally recognized Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations. Also, other Indian tribes who are not federally recognized should certainly be considered. Tribal preservation historic preservation organizations, others with an interest in the preservation outcomes of the project, and others with a legal or an economic interest. These are all folks who should be considered when you're determining consulting parties for a project. This is not this list, you're not confined to this list. If there are parties beyond this that you feel should be involved, then absolutely involve them. And the State Historic Preservation Office or the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, when the agency reaches out to them, may recommend additional consulting parties at that point. So who can do this step one? Who can initiate the Section 106 process? Certainly, the federal agency official can initiate Section 106. Also, a responsible entity, for instance, under HUD, a responsible entity may be the city or a tribe or a municipality. Those representatives can initiate the Section 106 process. Federal agencies will also sometimes delegate authority to initiate Section 106 to another entity. So in that instance, an authorized representative of the federal agency can initiate the Section 106 process. It's important that the federal agency is involved because the federal agency is responsible for Section 106. Federal involvement is the reason for Section 106. And so we need to make sure that consulting parties are contacted by this agency or somebody who has authority. So that's step one, identifying the project and identifying the appropriate people to be consulting. Once we've done that, we move on to step two, identify historic properties. Under this step, you're really doing two things. You're defining the area the project may affect, which in Section 106 we call the area of potential effect, or APE, and you are identifying and assessing the National Register eligibility of any properties within that area. So your area of potential effect, this is another definition for you, is the geographic area or areas within which an undertaking, a federal project, may cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties. So you're looking, this is everything in Section 106 is about historic properties and how they may be affected. So that's what we're looking for with our APE. And it's important to note that the size and shape of an APE is influenced by the scale and the nature of an undertaking. So different APEs will have different shapes depending on what the agency is wanting to do. And an area of potential effect may change during the Section 106 review process. For instance, if there are new effects identified, new properties that we acknowledge as historic properties as we go through the process, we may need to expand the APE to consider all of the effects to those. Or if the undertaking is modified during consultation, we may restrict the APE to avoid impacts to historic properties by changing the nature of the project in certain areas, for instance. Here are some just different kinds of APEs that I'm providing as an example. The one on the left is a rehabilitation project in a neighborhood. This neighborhood is actually a newer construction, and we're impacting one building. It's not a historic neighborhood, so the APE for this project is minimal and confined to the area where there may be potential to affect maybe archaeological resources. The second one is a cell tower project. So we've got a large circle here that denotes the potential visual impacts from this construction of a new cell tower project. There's also an area at the center of this circle where physical disturbances are occurring, and so those impacts are also considered under this type of project. And the top, I've got a replacement of water meters in a city, and so we've got all of these little dots noting where this work is occurring throughout the city, and we're reviewing it that way. And then the lower right, we've got some oil and gas pipeline work that's happening outside of a pipeline right of way. And so they have defined very me know if anybody's having trouble with the connection, and I can make sure to repeat anything that's missed, but hopefully everything is all right. So identifying historic properties in the area of potential effect. So we have guidance on this from the Advisory Council. The agency official shall make a reasonable and good faith effort to identify historic properties. And there's a handout attached to this presentation from the Advisory Council on meeting the reasonable and good faith effort standard. You can find that to the right. And some examples of how an agency may do this are through background research, consultation, oral history interviews, sample field investigations, or field survey. It's important to note that the following things are not, quote, required under Section 106. One, the SHPO or TIPO's approval is not required. Identification of every historic property in the APE is not required. Identifications outside of or below, if we're thinking of ground disturbing activities and depths of potential archaeological or other resources, identifications or investigations outside of or below a properly documented APE are not required, and ground verification of the entire APE is also not required. So for some very expansive projects, you might not expect to see an archaeological survey of the entire footprint, for instance, or clearing of all of the ground surface to identify features that might be hidden. That would not necessarily be required. Just something to consider. So again, we're under step 2. We're identifying historic properties in our properly defined area of potential effect. So we need to identify if there are resources and evaluate those resources if they exist. And to evaluate those resources, we look at their historical significance and integrity. To be eligible for the National Register, a resource, a property, a site, a building, whatever, needs to have historical significance and integrity that communicates its significance to the present. So if you need more information on how that works, please do check out Michael May's presentation on Tuesday, it's tomorrow, or have a look at our YouTube channel for previous or his upcoming presentation, which you'll be able to find there. So there are a couple of possible results of this step 2. As you come to step 2, you know, step 1, you've identified the project and who's involved. Step 2, you've identified the area of potential effect and you've identified historic properties, or you've looked to identify historic properties within your APE. So you may find no historic properties in your APE. If that is the case, the agency documents the no historic properties finding. The agency shares that finding and seeks concurrence with the State Historic Preservation Office or the Tribal Historic Preservation Office and other consulting parties for a 30-day review and comment period. And the agency informs consulting parties and the public of this finding. So this happens under step 2 if there are no historic properties identified, and if you receive concurrence from the State Historic Preservation Office and or Tribal Historic Preservation Office at this point, and you notify the public and they have their opportunity to comment, etc., then you may be done with the Section 106 process right here. However, there's another possibility. You may have identified historic properties in your APE. So that's the second option here. And if historic properties are identified, then you notify the State Historic Preservation Office and or Tribal Historic Preservation Office and other consulting parties, and you proceed to step 3. So that's where we'll go now. Step 3 is assessing adverse effects. So under this step of the Section 106 process, we assess whether a project will have an adverse effect on any historic property in our area of potential effect. And to do this, we apply the criteria of adverse effects, which are found under 36 CFR 800.5A1. and the agency will consult with the State Historic Preservation Office, Tribal Historic Preservation Office, tribes, and other parties, and will involve the public. It's important that the public has an opportunity to comment here as well. So let's just look at the definition of assessing adverse effects. An adverse effect to a historic property is found when an undertaking may alter, directly or indirectly, any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify the property for inclusion in the National Register in a manner that would diminish the integrity of the property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. These are aspects of integrity. Location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And so the idea of an adverse effect is you're doing something which is making a historic property less able to communicate its significance to the present. This is an adverse effect. It does a project does not have to make a property no longer eligible to the National Register to be adverse. It merely needs to diminish, to lessen the ability of that resource to communicate its significance to us. That is an adverse effect. So what are some examples of this? Well, demolition is kind of an obvious one. If you're going to demolish a historic property, that will adversely affect that historic property. Alterations to the property which are not consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards, those would be adverse effects. Removing a property is an adverse effect. Change of use of a property could be an adverse effect. And altering the setting of a historic property can be an adverse effect. Adding new intrusive elements to a historic property or to the setting can be an adverse effect. Neglect of a property. So if the agency's decision is to not do the necessary maintenance to protect a historic property from this neglect, that is still an adverse effect. And transfer out of ownership is considered an adverse effect to a historic property. And the reason for this is that once a property is transferred into private ownership, if it's a federally owned property and it's transferred to private ownership, then there's no longer the guarantee that Section 106 would exist to potentially protect the resource or to consider impacts to the resource. And so for that reason, transfer out of federal ownership can be considered an adverse effect. So we apply this criteria of adverse effect and to our project, and we have two options for the result. Either we have a finding of no adverse effect, and in that instance, the agency official documents the no adverse effect finding. The agency official shares that finding with consulting parties for a 30-day review and comment period, and the agency informs the public. Again, the public has to have an opportunity to comment at this. The public has to have an opportunity to comment on these federal undertakings under Section 106. And I do see a question: if a site is on the National Register and excavation is going on at the site, what does that do to the status of the site? And so if we're talking about a project that is occurring and has ground disturbance at the location of a National Register listed, or frankly, an archaeological site that would be eligible for the National Register, then that is certainly potential to adversely affect the archaeological site. That has to be considered during the process. Mary, let me know if that did not answer your question. So we have the potential for no adverse effect if the agency documents these three, follows these steps, and provides this documentation to the consulting parties and receives concurrence. If there's disagreement, we address the disagreement, and then we continue. But if we come to a no adverse effect concurrence, then we would be done here at the end of step 3. However, If we identify an adverse effect to historic properties in our area of potential effect for this project, then we proceed to step 4. Step 4 is the last step of the Section 106 process, and let's do it. Well, maybe not. So I do want to note that if an agency has delegated Section 106 initiation to an applicant or another entity, that delegation does not include resolution of adverse effects to historic properties. So at this stage, if there is a delegated authority, the federal agency must step in to address adverse effects to historic properties. And the federal agency remains responsible for all findings and eligibility determinations. And only the federal agency can conclude the Section 106 process in cases of an adverse effect finding. So now we'll go to step 4. And step 4 is resolving adverse effects. So we've gone through the process. We've identified the project and who we're working with, the consulting parties. We have identified historic properties in our area of potential effect. We've properly documented our area of potential effect and identified that there are historic properties present. And then we have addressed those historic properties and found that there are the project will have an adverse effect to them. What do we do now? We develop and evaluate alternatives or modifications to avoid, to minimize, or to mitigate those adverse effects. And we do that through consultation. The agency notifies the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP, of the adverse effect finding and invites their participation in consultation. The CHP may participate, they may decline to participate, or they may decline at the time and be willing to participate later if somebody requests their involvement. At this stage, we continue consulting to develop and evaluate alternatives or modifications. So the agency may be able to identify ways that they can change their project that will still meet their needs, but may not impact or may have less impact on the resource. And so minimization can be a way to address this, this adverse effect. Or changes to the project that can avoid the historic property, avoid impacts to the historic property. That's great also. It's not always possible. Sometimes the agency has to do something in order to meet its programming needs that will adversely affect a historic property. And we acknowledge that. And when that happens, we find a way to mitigate, to the agency finds something that they can do to try and mitigate the damage that they've done or the effects that they've had to that historic property. The State Historic Preservation Office and in the state of Oklahoma, the Archaeological Survey, or the Tribal Historic Preservation Office and the Advisory Council and tribes and other consulting parties are involved in this consultation at this stage. And then an agreement would be reached through consultation. All parties are willing to sign off on an agreement document that resolves those adverse effects. Again, remember that delegating Section 106 consultation to an applicant or another entity does not include the resolution of adverse effects to historic properties. The federal agency remains responsible for all findings and eligibility determinations and is the only entity that can conclude the Section 106 process in cases of adverse effect findings. So at the end of this 4th step, an agreement document, usually a memorandum of agreement, recording measures to resolve adverse effects is developed in consultation and executed. All the parties that need to sign it prior to the project approval. Once this agreement document is executed, then you've demonstrated that the agency is committing to certain actions. All parties who sign are committing to certain actions, and the project can proceed. If parties cannot reach an agreement, the federal agency must obtain formal advisory comments from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The agency must consider those comments and through their consideration determine whether or not to proceed with the project. So there is always a way to get through the process. even if parties disagree. So let's talk for a minute then about these agreement documents. So I mentioned memoranda of agreements, which can be used to resolve adverse effects at the end of a four-step Section 106 process. There are also other agreement document types. Agreement documents are legally binding documents in which the project, the federal agency, and other signatory parties and their roles are identified, and the stipulations are explicitly described, and responsible parties are also identified. You can find information about these agreements through the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's website. They have guidance for drafting these documents. You can find examples through federal agency websites all over. We have a number of agreement documents in-house. They are no longer accessible directly through our website. They may be in the future, but for now, if you need access to an agreement document, you can contact our office to get that access. So these two types of agreement documents can do a couple of different things. So a memorandum of agreement can be used to document mitigation, minimization, or of known or defined adverse effects on a federal undertaking, for example. So this is the most typical way to resolve an adverse effect finding in the Section 106 process through an MOA. You can also have a programmatic agreement, or PA, and this is a document that can be used to document multiple or complicated undertakings where you can't fully determine the effects in advance. And so a programmatic agreement can walk through exactly how everybody is going to proceed in these projects, and what you're going to do at each stage as you identify properties or as you identify effects, etc. You can also use a programmatic agreement to document federal agency programs and routine maintenance, for instance, so that you can essentially take care of a type of project in advance. So you can address how certain projects will be reviewed, will be handled, and then you would not have to individually submit each of those projects for review. You would just have sort of a guidebook for this is how we've agreed in consultation to handle this type of project. We do step 1 and 2 and 3, and we have a number of these agreement documents in the state also. And for more information on drafting these agreement documents and for drafting them in working with our office to execute these agreement documents, you can find this presentation that I gave in a previous year, drafting and executing Section 106 agreement documents with the OKSHPO, on our YouTube channel. So let's talk about some program alternatives, looking at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Program alternatives, which can include nationwide programmatic agreements and prototype programmatic agreements, exempted categories, standard treatments, program comments, and alternative procedures. These are all program alternatives defined by the Advisory Council. You can find more information about each of them and a number of these actual agreements on the Advisory Council website at the link here. You can also find these links in the useful links handout. Some examples of nationwide programmatic agreements are the Federal Communications Commission, nationwide PA for co-locations of wireless antennas, also the nationwide PA for certain undertakings approved by FCC. So those would be tower projects. The process for submitting the Section 106 process for a new cell tower is clearly defined in this nationwide programmatic agreement. Exempted categories. Under 36 CFR 814C, exempted categories exempt a category of undertakings whose effects to historic properties are known and not significant. And so there are a number of these exempted categories that you can find on the Advisory Council's website. including the interstate highway system exemption, natural gas pipelines exemption, electric vehicle supply equipment exemption, GSA routine operations and maintenance exemption, and exemption for Indigenous knowledge informed activities by Hawaiian organizations. Like I said, these are all on the Advisory Council's website. You can see these and more there. Program comment. An agency can request the Advisory Council's comment on a category of undertakings in lieu of comments on a case-by-case basis. There are a number of examples of this that you can also find on the Advisory Council website. These include projects that affect post-1945 bridges, program comments for positive train control. These are FCC type projects that are occurring in rail right-of-way. Wireless communication facilities. Like I said, you can review the various program comments from the Advisory Council on their website. This slide just briefly discusses the program comment for federal communications projects, which is from March of 2024 and can be used by federal agencies who must comply with Section 106 when deploying communications activities throughout the country. You can find that recent program comment on the Advisory Council's website. Another recent program comment from the Advisory Council is the program comment on certain housing, building, and transportation undertakings. Appendix A of this program comment provides a list of undertakings that do not require further review, and Appendix B provides a list of undertakings that could proceed without further Section 106 review after the satisfaction of certain conditions, exclusions, or requirements. Note that the federal agency must notify the Advisory Council if they're choosing to use this program comment before implementing its terms for any undertaking. So that's all my basic information on Section 106. And now what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about how to submit a project here in Oklahoma. So if you are submitting a project for our review, we currently still need to receive your submittal in hard copy. Our office is still a hard copy office. We have physical files for all of these projects, which we retain for 7 years. And we still need to see the hard copy. Please include a cover letter that's got the complete return address and contact information, the responsible federal agency, the full title of the program, the licensing or permitting program, funding, licensing, or permitting program. And if you're not the federal agency or a federal agency representative, include your authority to consult by, for instance, enclosing your delegation of authority letter. Include in this cover letter brief description of the project and the precise location, including the county, the legal location, or GPS coordinates or street address. Give us information that helps us to specifically identify the location. And include whether or not your area of potential effect, the project location and your area of potential effect, is vacant land, or if there are built environment resources present. And if there are, if you have any buildings in your area of potential effect as you're initially identifying it, are those buildings 45 years old? If they are not 45 years old, if they're younger than 45 years old, our office just wants to know the address and the year that they were constructed. You can provide that in a table if you have a lot of them. If you have buildings that are 45 years old or older, we have information that we want to know about those buildings in order to comment on their potential eligibility, the buildings and structures, I should say. And so for these, we've developed a form that includes all of that information that we're asking for, and that's our Historic Preservation Resource Identification form. You can find that on our website also. So information about your project, federal involvement, your project location, where it's happening, and if there are any known buildings or structures there, but also include a map that illustrates your project location and show us the boundaries of your APE if you have identified a potential APE for this project. And please enclose copies of any new or updated forms, such as archaeological site forms, historic preservation resource identification forms, bridge forms, etc. And if this is a project that's sort of been ongoing or it's related to an earlier project, tell us our SHPO file number. That's the number we include in our RE line on any of our responses, and that's how we track these projects in our office. So if you are looking at something that you've done in the past, or you're changing a former project or anything like this, and you reference that SHPO file number, that will help us gather all of the information that we have in our office to be able to respond. We have a SHPO consultation form. We are developing an online portal, and the SHPO consultation form is something that we've used to develop the sort of questions that we're asking you to input on the online form, on the online submittal. This online portal is not ready, unfortunately. I really wish it were, but we're still working on it. And if you start using the SHPO consultation form with your submittal, that will help make the process easier for you as we transition to a new online system someday. Again, I want to remind you that if you're submitting something to the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, our office works with the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey to complete Section 106 reviews. If you have any potential ground disturbing activity with your project, you'll want to make sure that when you send it to us, you're also sending it to them. That helps to make sure that both of our offices are on the same 30-day review clock, so you get your response letters promptly from both of us. This is the address for the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey. Again, they maintain the site files and they assist our office by commenting on project effects to pre-contact archaeological resources. If your project has no potential, you're not doing anything that's involving ground disturbance, you're replacing some doors maybe, or it's a window project on a house, those do not need to go to the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey. Also, if you're doing a co-location on an existing cell tower, but you're not expanding the footprint, you're not doing anything with ground disturbance, again, those projects do not have to go to the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey. If you're not sure, send it to both of us. So this is a quick note on the 30-day review period. The Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office and the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey have 30 calendar days from receipt of adequate documentation to respond to Section 106 requests. And our office will respond. We are down to now 5. We've been able to hire a secretary back, but we're down to 5 staff members, but we still respond to every project request within the 30-day time period. So if you've not received what you consider to be a timely response, reach out and we'll confirm that we received your submittal. If your submittal was not received by our office, then you've not met the obligations under Section 106. And again, remember the 30-day review clock begins the date documentation is received. Emergency reviews, these are an exception to the 30 days. If the federal agency determines the project complies with the Executive Order 14156, we do accept email submittals in those instances. They should be provided to our office and to the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey at these email addresses. This is our Section 106 page, Section 106 or Section 106 email, Section 106 at history.ok.gov. Please include this email. If you want to copy me, that's fine, but don't send me your emergency project directly to my email address. It must go to the Section 106 email in order to ensure that we can respond within that 7-day timeline. And please do include national energy emergency in the subject line. The email, just like with any other project, must be submitted by the federal agency or their delegated authority, and OKSHPO and OAS will respond in our allotted time. And here's my contact information. So if you have any questions, you can reach me here, and I'm very happy to answer those.